While Russia continues to bombard Ukraine, pursuing its invasion of the nation as part of President Vladimir Putin's ruthless conquest, many Western nations continue to ponder the question: where might Putin strike next? For a long time, there's been a lingering fear that Russia could take further military action elsewhere in Europe, perhaps targeting the Baltic states of Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania to bridge the gap between the main body of Russia and its small Kaliningrad Oblast, which sits between Poland and Lithuania. To counteract any possible threat in the area, the Baltic nations have been strengthening their defences. But they're not the only ones. The US military also recently carried out some very interesting exercises in that part of the world, sending a clear message to the Kremlin in the process. Indeed, only a few days ago, in the early hours of the morning, just as the sun began to rise, approximately a dozen US Marines took up their posts on the Swedish island of Gotland, located less than 200 miles from the Russian enclave of Kaliningrad. They then carried out a test of a mobile rocket system, launching dummy rockets into the Baltic Sea. There's no doubt about it, the Kremlin will be watching this, and it won't like what it sees. In recent times, with US President Donald Trump's position on the Russia-Ukraine war being somewhat unclear and contradictory at times, countries across Europe have been flung into a state of panic. Many fear what might happen if the US military presence on the continent were to dwindle or disappear, and how that might empower the Kremlin to push on and pursue further invasions. But with these recent exercises near Kaliningrad, the US military is making a clear statement. It's not going anywhere, and it's ready to defend NATO territory alongside its European allies. Indeed, even after Trump has previously talked about reducing US military engagement in foreign lands, American commanders on the ground in Europe clearly remain committed to the cause. For example, Brigadier General Andrew Saslav, Deputy Chief of Staff for Operations for US Army Europe and Africa, summed up his thoughts quite simply: "From a US Army perspective, my orders haven't changed." He also said, "I've been doing this too long to get hyper-focused on political wins and messaging that isn't orders." Now, the test rocket launches into the Baltic Sea are just one part of a multi-week training exercise, nicknamed Swift Response 25. Led by the US and running from May 11 to May 31 in locations around the Baltic Sea and far north of Europe, Swift Response involves not just US troops, but those from various other nations, including France, Germany, the UK, the Netherlands, and Poland, all carrying out a range of tests and exercises side by side. In total, around 25,000 troops from 29 nations have been involved. One exercise, for example, involved paratroopers from the US performing a tactical jump into Lithuania, sharing the skies with troops from France, Germany, Italy, and the Netherlands. Recent days have also seen Polish and Finnish forces carrying out live-fire exercises, Polish paratroopers diving into Finland, Spanish and US paratroopers carrying out a mixture of live fire and joint airborne operations, and Lithuania hosting a field hospital exercise under the most intense simulated conditions, demonstrating NATO's frontline medical capabilities in case of chemical, biological, radiological, or even nuclear warfare. The 82nd Airborne Division of the US Army, nicknamed the All-American Division and famed for its efficacy and skill, has also been part of Swift Response 25, leading a major airborne assault exercise. And this has all been carried out to not only demonstrate the powers and capabilities of NATO forces, but also to prepare them for a possible future conflict in the area. Of course, it also has the added bonus of sending a serious warning to Russian observers. It shows that NATO is ready, willing, and able to defend itself and won't back down in the face of Kremlin aggression. What's more, Swift Response 25 is just the starting point of a much larger US-led exercise called Defender 25, which has the ultimate aim of strengthening NATO's position in order to deter any possible military action against the alliance and shine a spotlight on its rapid deployment capacities. Multiple videos of the training exercises have been shared online, showing some of the intense activities involved as paratroopers deploy their parachutes in the air, soldiers fire rifles across snowy terrain, helicopters soar across the scene, and groups of troops take up strategic positions, simulating real-life battles with incredible accuracy. Those videos also include commentary for some of the commanders involved in Swift Response, sharing more details about the objectives and nature of the training. Commanders like US Colonel Tracy Michael, head of the 68th Theatre Medical Command, US Army Europe and Africa, who was involved in the field hospital training.
Swift Response 25 is really the first portion of the Defender series that we go through. And specifically in this portion of the exercise, there's 3 key objectives from a Theater Medical Command perspective that we're looking to focus on. One is a hospital exercise, which allows us to deploy a U.S. field hospital, establish it, and then integrate allies and partners into the hospital. Along with that is a hospital exercise. And that hospital exercise involves the validation of that field hospital, specifically to NATO standards. That's very important because as we look to conduct operations with our allies and partners, we need to make sure that we're interoperable and that we can mutually support each other in an area of operations. And then the last objective is experimentation. We're utilizing drones and lessons that we've learned from the Ukraine and other conflicts to integrate this critical capability.
So, US and other NATO troops are not just following the usual routine of training exercises or working with equipment and tactics they already know. They're also using this opportunity to experiment with new hardware and battlefield strategies to perhaps uncover more efficient and effective ways to operate, especially in this part of the world, where conditions are often quite harsh due to rugged terrain and inhospitable conditions. And the idea of experimentation leads all the way back to the original missile launch test discussed at the start of this video, as those were actually the very first time that HIMARS and MLRS missile systems were tested in the area. This particular part of Swift Response 25 involved US and British troops. First, British paratroopers conducted an airdrop just north of Gotland's only commercial airport, Visby Airport. They secured the landing zone so that American aircraft carrying the long-range rocket launchers could safely land. The launchers were then deployed and fired into the Baltic Sea, albeit with dummy munitions. The nature of the exercise and the way it was conducted were said to be extremely realistic and reflective of a real-world conflict, showing just how quickly and effectively NATO can get not just boots on the ground, but also missiles in the air in response to any perceived threat. As for the systems themselves, they're some of the most powerful elements of the NATO arsenal. The HIMARS system can fire guided multiple launch rocket system rockets, otherwise known as GMLRS, which have a range of around 45 miles, as well as long-range Army Tactical Missile System missiles, or ATACMS, which can travel distances of more than 180 miles, hitting targets a considerable way away. The MLRS System 2 has impressive range and has been proven to hit targets around 185 miles away, with the possibility of extending its range further in the future. HIMARS have been supplied to Ukraine since the early stages of the invasion and have been hugely effective, giving the Ukrainian armed forces a way to strike back against Russia rather than simply suffering strike after strike on their own soil. In June 2024, for example, Ukraine used US-made HIMARS to strike a Russian air defense battery near the city of Belgorod, more than 20 miles north of the Ukraine-Russia border. But why did all of this training take place in Gotland? Why was it so important for the missile launchers to be tested on such a small and seemingly insignificant island off the eastern coast of Sweden? Well, it's because Gotland is far from insignificant. From a military standpoint, it's one of NATO's most strategic strongholds and could play a crucial, even defining role in future conflicts in the Baltic area. This is thanks to its prime location in the heart of the Baltic Sea, not far from the coast of Kaliningrad, Lithuania, Latvia and Estonia. Stefan Lundqvist, Sweden chair to the Ted Stevens Center for Arctic Security Studies in Alaska, sums up Gotland's value here. As Russia's maritime strategic locations in the Baltic Sea are very weak, any conflict will include Russia immediately seeking to occupy key port areas in the Baltics, Finland and Poland. The key military strategic location of Gotland will most likely be the scene of hostile action in the opening stage of conflict. Indeed, while the future remains uncertain, it's likely that Gotland would prove invaluable for whichever side controlled in a possible Russia versus NATO war. If Russia took over Gotland, it could dramatically hinder sea and air supply routes to the Baltic nations. That would make it much easier for Russia to then invade those territories without having to worry about NATO troops and arms rapidly arriving on the scene. Meanwhile, if NATO maintains control of Gotland, it can use it to control the flow of supplies towards Latvia, Estonia and Lithuania, bolstered by the military capabilities of the Swedish armed forces. Troops, weapons, munitions and more could all be transported there by air or sea, before pushing onward as needed to defend the Baltics. Indeed, Gotland has historically been referred to as a sort of unsinkable aircraft carrier, the perfect base for military operations in the region. Gotland was demilitarized in 2005 and remained that way for more than a decade. This was done to help promote a spirit of peace, stability and cooperation in the region. But Russian aggression in Crimea in 2014 changed the game. And in 2016, Sweden made the call to reintroduce permanent troops to the island. It later pursued NATO membership, joining the alliance on March 7, 2024. These days, Gotland is a core focus of Sweden's rearmament and military strengthening campaigns, and it's not hard to understand why. As Michael Bodén, Sweden's Supreme Commander of the Armed Forces, explained, "I'm sure that Putin even has both eyes on Gotland. Putin's goal is to gain control of the Baltic Sea. If Russia takes control and seals off the Baltic Sea, it would have an enormous impact on our lives in Sweden and all other countries bordering the Baltic Sea. We can't allow that. The Baltic Sea must not become Putin's playground where he terrifies NATO members. If Putin invades Gotland, he can threaten NATO countries from the sea. That would be the end of peace and stability in the Nordic and Baltic regions." Now, due to these fears, Sweden is not leaving anything to chance as it bolsters its position on Gotland. Hundreds of military conscripts are sent to the island each year, and its projected total wartime strength is around 4,500 troops. Numerous military exercises, such as Swift Response 25, have also been conducted on Gotland over recent years, and a wider range of military forces have gotten involved in those exercises since Sweden joined the ranks of NATO. If the US and its allies were able to deploy the likes of HIMARS and MLRS missile systems in key strategic locations across this island, as they have recently been training to do, they could theoretically fire on key targets across the Baltics and even parts of Kaliningrad. That would give NATO a huge tactical advantage over its enemies in terms of defending Baltic territory. What's more, as the Defender training operations continue, the US and NATO allies may discover even more ways to gain an edge over Russia, using the territorial advantage at its disposal to quell any potential Kremlin threat. All of this should, at least in theory, deter Russia from even thinking about any further invasions beyond Ukraine. And while Russia is clearly in the spotlight right now, it's not the only focus here. As General Christopher Donahue, Commanding General of the US Army Europe and Africa, sums up. This is about global deterrence. Everything we demonstrate with our allies and partners, we can replicate globally. Defender gives us critical repetitions at scale for theatre logistics and war fighting. In other words, Russia shouldn't be the only country paying attention to what's happening on Gotland and the surrounding areas. China, and any other country that might oppose NATO in years to come, should also watch closely, witness the combined and arguably insurmountable military might of the Western NATO nations, and think twice about any invasions or military actions of any kind against any member of the alliance. Indeed, one of the most impressive elements to emerge from Swift Response 25 was just how well all of the different nations' armed forces work together, carrying out coordinated jumps and missions in collaboration, working side by side, despite their different national backgrounds and native languages. It's one of the clearest ever demonstrations of NATO's combined strength, and many of the exercises involved were only made possible through collaboration. The US, for example, supplied large military transport aircraft like the C-17 Globemaster III and C-13OJ Super Hercules, while the UK brought the Airbus A400M Atlas, and other nations supplied their own vehicles, weaponry and equipment. This is what NATO is all about. Teamwork, togetherness, unity. Line after line after line of trained, willing and able troops of multiple nationalities, all determined to fight for a common cause, to defend one another and to stand firm in the face of aggression. And those are the kinds of unique advantages that Russia cannot counter. Belarus is its closest and most reliable ally, but other relationships with nations around the globe have been fractured since the invasion of Ukraine. So, should Russia ever decide to invade the Baltic nations or anywhere else, it may be forced to stand more or less alone, relying solely on its own forces and capabilities to succeed, with entire teams of allied countries standing in its way. Another impressive element of the Swift Response 25 exercises was how well the troops involved adapted to the difficult conditions they found themselves in. There was snow on the ground, low temperatures during the days and night, and difficult unfamiliar landscapes for the troops to deploy into and navigate. Yet, despite the challenges, the troops found a way. As US Marine Corps Lieutenant Colonel Anthony Ansley, the commanding officer of the Combat Logistics Battalion 22, proudly proclaimed,
"This environment was challenging, but the Marines were more than prepared for it because we did operational readiness training prior to getting here. But the snow, it definitely slowed us down. It didn't stop us though. The rain definitely wet us and made our uniforms a little bit heavier, but we kept stepping. And I can tell you the impacts on our weapons with the maintenance, it challenged us and to think through how do we maintain things in this type of environment we're not used to, but we kept fighting and we kept banging."
This is important because any prospective conflict with Russia will be likely to take place on difficult terrain and in harsh conditions, in areas like Finland or Estonia, which sees large amounts of snow and cold temperatures, for example. The Russian forces are perfectly used to operating in those kinds of conditions, and so are some NATO member forces, but not all of them. Operations like Swift Response 25 allow troops that are used to working in warmer or sunnier locations to become more familiar with that type of terrain and climate. So, if and when any kind of conflict breaks out, they'll be ready. And that's why training exercises like this are so valuable for NATO and the future safety of the world order. It's also hugely important that countries like Finland and Sweden have joined the alliance, expanding NATO territory and creating a much stronger blockade between Russia and the West. Christian Atland, Senior Research Fellow of the Norwegian Defence Research Establishment, which helps inform and advise the armed forces of Norway, sums it up. Now that Finland and Sweden have become members of NATO, we have a continuous piece of NATO territory north of the Arctic Circle. The Nordic NATO enlargement has also made it easier for NATO to transfer reinforcements to the Baltic states in the event of a military crisis or conflict in that region. In short, the addition of Sweden and Finland represents a big boon to NATO, opening new opportunities for training, preparedness and defence. But NATO has to act quickly to make the most of those opportunities, to secure its tactical advantages and to discover the best ways of using new land at its disposal to strengthen its borders. It's no surprise then that Swift Response 25 isn't the first time a major military training exercise has taken place on Gotland. In 2024, 20 NATO allies, including the US, Sweden and Poland, took part in Baltics 2024, a maritime training exercise focused on preparing to defend and deter any military action or provocation within the Baltic Sea. It involved more than 50 ships, approximately 85 aircraft, and around 9,000 troops, and it was the first time Sweden got to participate in training as a full NATO member. Baltics 24 also involved the biggest assembled coalition of amphibious forces in Baltic waters, as well as the largest ever coalition of mine countermeasure forces in NATO. This was another big sign of NATO's commitment to putting in the time, effort, resources and investment necessary to ward off Russian aggression and demonstrate how ready it is to defend that area. In other words, if Putin is truly thinking of targeting the Baltic nations, he may want to think again. Now, what are your thoughts on all of this? Should the Kremlin be concerned about the US and its allies testing missiles in the Baltic Sea? Will this be enough to deter additional Russian invasions, or could Putin have something more sinister up his sleeve? Share your thoughts in the comments below, and remember to subscribe to The Military Show for more up-to-date news and information about emerging and ongoing conflicts around the globe.